Let's say you're very tired, but you have to keep yourself from falling asleep. What's your best way to stay awake? Because if you happen to be staying at Black Canyon Campgrounds in Arizona, falling asleep is the last thing you should ever do. Something out there might be watching. Enjoy these allegedly true and scary stories featuring campground creatures, paranormal attackers, and monsters from the deep. Go to darkstories.org and send us your stories to have them narrated. Check out eeriecast.com to listen to our family of horror-themed podcasts. Question of the day: what's the creepiest thing you've ever experienced while trying to sleep? Now, let's begin. Eyes of the Forest, from solesolosoul. It was early spring of 2016. I had just turned 24 years old. My friend and I just reached our main spot to camp, Black Canyon Campgrounds, just outside of Payson, Arizona. We'd usually travel out here 2 or 3 times each year. It has some incredible views, and it's only a couple of hours away from the city. For the most part, this area was pretty secluded. A privately owned convenience store rested a few miles away, with a small town 20 miles before that. The entrance was on a dirt road, directly off the highway, with the campground sign at the start of the road, marking local wildlife, any fire hazards, and general news relevant to camping folk. The pathing is mostly linear, with maybe one fork, spanning several miles. We once traveled down the dirt road to see how far it would take us. One of the paths would take you to another highway entrance, with a ranger's tower halfway there. The other path led to a dead end. An abandoned cabin can be found on this path, a few miles in, mostly hidden off in the distance behind some larger foliage. The snow had mostly cleared up at this point, leaving crisp air, a slight chill, and fauna becoming active again. We'd usually spot some wild horses, several deer, and tons of little critters whenever we'd come out this way. It really was the perfect time of year for a relaxing trip to get away from the city for a few days. We got in around 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. That was late for us, as we'd usually try to make it out there by noon at the latest. This trip was pretty spontaneous. We both had work during the coming weekend, and decided to just go for it. The sun was setting fast, and we still hadn't picked out our spot to camp. There were maybe 2 other groups, both families, parked somewhat close to the entrance, only a few hundred yards away from the highway. This time around, we just wanted to get away from humans for a while. Customer service jobs will do that to you. We drove down the dirt road, past our usual spot, and finally picked the perfect area. A small clearing, just hanging off the edge of a hill. The whole valley could be seen from this area, with a beautiful sunset. This would have been our main spot from then on, if the next night's incident never happened. Anyway, we agreed to get a campfire going, and would just avoid building a tent this trip. We didn't have much time to do so anyway, and her car wasn't that uncomfortable. I would sleep in the back seat and she'd take the passenger seat. With the windows slightly ajar, we'd have a few blankets for each of us, and would soon fall into an unrivaled slumber. The following day went fairly uneventful. We just decompressed. I had this strange feeling throughout the day though, like we were being watched. There was the sound of crunching leaves just out of sight every few hours, but I figured it was just the local wildlife doing its thing. My friend didn't notice anything unusual, so I didn't dwell on it. Night fell, and the feeling still hadn't gone away. My friend must have felt something too, though she didn't vocalize it. I saw her take some of her sleeping pills. On our camping trips, she didn't usually need to take them. The nature's ambience was enough to put anyone to sleep, I thought. It was nearing 1 a.m. My friend dozed off in the passenger seat, while I attempted to wind down in the back. I leaned against the side window behind the passenger seat, legs outstretched to the car's back door. The window opposite of me was rolled down slightly, with a cold breeze flowing in. I had been on my phone scrolling through Facebook or whatever, when I heard something outside. A few crunches of the fallen leaves several paces outside the car. I whispered to my friend, "Did you hear that?" But she was already out. I put my phone down and listened intently for a minute or two. Nothing. It must have been a small animal, curious of our camp, I thought. I went back to my phone, scrolling through social media. About 10 minutes had passed when I heard it again. Crunch, right outside the door. I lowered my phone. My eyes took a moment to adjust from the light of the phone into the deep dark of the woods. As I turned the phone away from my face, the backlight illuminated the window above my feet. To this day, I can't get the image out of my head. Two dirty, scabbed hands held on to the window, the fingers wrapped inside the car. The nails were long, unkept, and dark. Behind the window, a silhouette of a face was pressed up against it. The breath would create condensation every few seconds. All I could make out were the reflection of those empty black eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It felt like eternity, the staring contest between me and this thing. Thoughts were repeating incessantly in my head. Why haven't they run away when they saw I noticed them? What were they planning? Was this the face of death? After probably 10 seconds of not doing anything, the hand slowly unclinched the window and receded into the darkness. The condensation on the window dispersed. Another couple of seconds passed before I heard the dreaded crunch, crunch, crunch melodically fading into the distance. I still just sat there. What in the world just happened? Why didn't I do anything? Why am I still not doing anything? With that thought, my body shot into adrenaline. I pounded on my friend's seat, waking her up from her slumber into a dizzy confusion. I unlatched and kicked open the back door and took a moment to scan the area. Whoever they were, whatever it was gone. I scrambled to pick up any important camping supplies we left outside, and just crammed everything into the back seat and trunk, periodically looking over my shoulder, listening for those footsteps. I slammed the back door shut, and there they were, a grim reminder of the horror that had happened. 2 handprints imprinted on the window. I quickly wiped them off the window in a panic, a reaction to erase the event, I guess. I jumped into the front seat, started the car, and floored it out of there. My friend, finally coming to, asked me what the heck I was doing. "We have to go," I said. "There's someone out there." I didn't see whatever or whoever it was while fleeing the scene. Speeding down the dirt road, my friend insisted I slow down, and I eventually did. We reached the highway, and I proceeded to drive 20 or so miles before we reached a Denny's, where my friend asked for us to stop at to eat, and to have me explain everything. The nightmares subsided a few months later. My embarrassment continues to this day for the state of shock I was in at the time. Everybody says you either have a fight or flight instinct, and I'm now confused whether I have either of those. I mean, I just sat there, and I did nothing. I frequently tend to ask myself who was out there. Was it another camper messing with us? Was it a resident of the abandoned cabin down the dirt road? Or maybe it was something more paranormal residing in that forest, watching lone, vulnerable campers as they drift off to dreamland. We'd still go camping there in the years ahead, but never too far from the highway. Whatever it was, I hope that's the last I've seen of it. Growls in the corn, from Crepuscular Creature. It was around June or July of 2018. My father brought me over to his now ex-fiance's house to play with her kids and get to know her better, since she was his girlfriend at the time. She had 2 daughters and 1 son, Ginny, Kara, and Lyle. Well, they lived next to a cornfield, which was owned by a neighbor who said it was okay to walk down the main trail of, as long as we didn't destroy the corn or cause chaos, just common sense respect for other people's land. It was starting to get dark when Lyle and I decided to take a walk down the main trail to the center of the field. Their pit bull, Jada, accompanied us. We walked and talked about random things such as our current obsession with Five Nights at Freddy's at the time, or what video games we might play on the Wii when we got back from the walk. We weren't at all nervous about the dark. Lyle decided to tell me a story about Jada, who was currently walking beside us. "A few years ago," he began, "we had some coyotes in the cornfield. They always made so much noise at night." Lyle hopped over a small stick before continuing. "Jada was never allowed outside after dark because of them. We didn't want her getting hurt or, killed, since coyotes can be dangerous. Well, one night, Ginny, his eldest sister, let Jada out accidentally, and she ran right into the corn, where we heard those coyotes before. They came into our yard and Jada absolutely destroyed them. She even ripped one of their tails off." Lyle ended his story there. I replied, "Dang, that sounds like it must have been scary. Coyotes can get pretty nasty." I spoke from experience. Many of our cats have been slaughtered over the years by those mangy mongrels. Lyle just nodded and then started to ramble on about football, which I didn't care for too much, but I didn't stop him from talking about it. After all, he's constantly surrounded by only sisters, and I honestly know how it is to be surrounded by the opposite gender most of the time, having been raised around all guys. We continued on, and when we made it to the center of the field, we decided to have a little race back down the path and to the house. Some friendly competition, right? So we both took off running. Jada joined us, but eventually she ran off into the cornfield, just enjoying herself. I was almost halfway down the path when Lyle yelled for me to stop and let him catch up. He was beginning to get scared of the dark, as everything minus ourselves and Jada had gone silent. I let him catch up and we began to walk together. It was now extremely dark. We couldn't see more than 5 feet in front of us clearly, so we took our time. A shiver made its way up my spine as we walked, which I thought was funny, but I didn't say anything to Lyle for fear of him getting really scared and throwing a fit or crying. I didn't want to be blamed for scaring him, since I was the older kid in the situation. As we passed a little after the halfway mark on the trail, we both heard a low, bone-chilling growl from the corn. At that point, we looked at each other, fearing together that we were about to be attacked or die. Lyle especially seemed petrified, shaken to the core, as if he had seen something I hadn't. But I got his attention, and together we sprinted back to the house. When we made it back, Jada was sitting in the garage with everyone else, being petted by my father, who questioned us about what was wrong. "Something growled at us in the corn," Lyle blurted out, seemingly on the verge of tears. I just nodded, being at a loss for words. My dad's girlfriend frowned slightly, a disbelieving look in her eyes. "We were walking back after our race, and when we were just about at the end of the path, we heard something growl right next to us," I panted, still trying to catch my breath. My dad's girlfriend shrugged it off, but I knew my dad believed us. He even believed in things like werewolves and Bigfoot. He claims to have seen Bigfoot at one point. But the next time I would go over to their house, Lyle admitted to me that he did in fact see something more. A pair of glowing red eyes, which stood 7 feet off the ground. The encounter scared him so bad, he said he would never go into that cornfield again. Lyle and his family moved out of that house a few months later, so I never had the chance to encounter anything else strange out there. Invisible Restraints, from Crystal Holly 22. Years ago, when I was young, about 8 or 9, I had an experience with the paranormal that will always stick with me. The home I used to live in, I believe it was haunted, and so did my family. I would get weird feelings in different areas of the house, and I'd often feel as if I wasn't alone. I'd see things move in the shadows, hear voices that belonged to no one. I've had many experiences within that home, but this one is one that still haunts me to this day. At the time, my bed was broken, so I had to sleep on a mattress that was laid out on the floor. This scared me because I had a bad feeling about sleeping on the floor like that. I drifted off to sleep one night, sometime between 9 to 10 p.m. Mind you, I'm a light sleeper. I awake to the slightest sounds or touches. I awake around 3 a.m. to this heavy, intense feeling. I felt this weight all over my body. I wanted to sit up so that the feeling of heaviness or weight would go away, but when I tried to move, I couldn't. Something wasn't allowing me to move. When I tried to, I felt a force, specifically on my wrists and ankles, as if some presence was holding me down, something that felt extremely evil. Horrified, I was praying in my head that someone would wake up so I could call out for help to them. To my luck, I heard one of my brothers approaching the bathroom by my room. When he turned the bathroom light on, I turned my head and tried to yell "help me" to him. But to my horror, what came out was a scratchy, breathless whisper. I tried again, "help me." But it was the same breathless whisper sound. It wasn't loud enough to be heard by him. Whatever force that was holding me down to the mattress had taken my voice away. Soon my brother walked away, and I was left alone in the darkness once again. I was so terrified, I passed out, and I didn't wake till morning. The first thing I did was tell my mother about the night before. Thankfully, she believed me. We prayed together, but that was all we could really do. I've never encountered anything like this before or since then. Some of you may say it was sleep paralysis, but I know deep inside it wasn't, as I was able to move, except I was being forced down by my ankles and wrists. It was something malevolent, with dark intentions. The Shadow Walker, from Diiviine. It was around midnight, and I was packing my backpack, getting ready to leave my cousin's house. We spend a lot of time together, going back and forth between each other's houses, as we live about 45 minutes apart. We're both located in the busy suburbs of Southern California, so it's honestly just the traffic that takes up most of the driving time. I was packing my backpack, and we said our goodbyes as I climbed into my car. "Drive safe. Text me when you're home," she yelled from her front porch. "Thanks, I'm not tired, so I'll be okay," I responded. After my cousin had gone back inside her house, I sat in my car and organized my stuff, then turned on some music. I began to feel uneasy for no reason. My mother had always taught us to be aware of our surroundings, because you never know who or what is around. I decided to start driving without deciding on a playlist to listen to for the long ride home, because of how I was feeling at the time. So instead I turned on the radio. Bob Marley blared through my stereo, singing his famous song "One Love." As I drove down the street lamps glowed and illuminated my path. I soon made it out of our neighborhood, and I turned down the road I take all the way back to my home. This street is a thoroughfare, and is always busy, even late into the night. This particular night, I hadn't seen one car yet, and I was alone on the road. This is what I prefer due to how heavy the traffic in our area becomes sometimes. So I was cruising along, and noticed a few of the street lamps flicker as I drove under them. I figured it was just because they were old, but when they flicker it always made me feel a little unsettled. At approximately 12:30 a.m., I was coming up on one of the larger but soft curves in the road. There are neighborhoods that line this street, and it's not uncommon to see people in this area walking to or from work on the sidewalks. I'm a habitual speeder, normally going 10 to 15 miles per hour over the speed limit, as are most Californians, but this night was an exception. I remember clearly going 35 miles per hour up until this point, in the 45-mile-per-hour zone. It was then that I looked ahead at the sidewalk, and standing under a street lamp, facing the street, I saw a man. It was hard to tell exactly what he looked like, but his figure appeared dark, about 6 feet tall, with a medium build. He looked as if he were wearing a black long-sleeve shirt and black pants. I got the feeling he was trying to cross the street as he was facing the road, and he began to look towards my car. I hit my brakes, slowing down to around 15 to 20 miles per hour, anticipating him not seeing me, and stepping out into the street. Sure enough, he stepped off the curb and walked across the street towards the median. "Oh, glad I saw him. If I didn't slow down, I might have hit him if he didn't see me," I thought to myself, checking to make sure my headlights were on. They were. I proceeded to drive slowly about 100 feet to where the man had crossed, but as I got closer, I saw no one. No man, woman, person, or thing was even within sight. No one was there. The thing I'd seen cross the street simply vanished into the brisk night air. My heart pounded, and chills shot up my spine. I frantically checked my mirrors to see if I'd simply overlooked him. I even turned around and drove back through, but there was nothing. Who or what did I just see cross the road? Ghosts don't exist. Those are all just fairy tales, I sort of mumbled to myself. I drove home dazed and confused. Once I got back into my area, I started to see a few cars. I pulled into my driveway and went straight to bed. The next morning, I was talking to my parents, and I asked them about that specific area, without mentioning what had happened. After some conversation and evading the incident, my dad finally mentioned that someone a few years back had tried to cross the street in that very spot and was hit by a car. You see, the driver didn't see them, because the person was wearing all black. I think the shadow walker I saw may have been the ghost of that man, trapped in an eternal loop, just trying to find his way back home. Oregon Coast Mermaid Encounter from Zebro 100. Around July 2011, I was 21 years old. My aunt and uncle from my dad's side of the family in the Midwest came out to visit my family that lives in the Pacific Northwest. One of the highlights of their trip was that my uncle, who was my dad's sister's husband, and not related to me by blood, though he was still a cool guy, wanted to experience deep-sea halibut fishing on the Oregon coast, which my dad had arranged via a charter, and lucky enough for me, I had the privilege of being able to go on this fishing trip with my uncle and father. A little information about me before we continue is that despite my use of a wheelchair, I always loved activities such as fishing, hiking, traveling, and camping, because staying still is just not an option for me. However, the day before we were set to go out, our charter was canceled due to bad weather. While we were all disappointed at this setback, to put it lightly, my dad, uncle, and I were determined to do a little bit of fishing, and decided on a place called Devil's Lake, located near where we were staying on the Oregon coast. So the day after the charter was canceled, my dad, my uncle, and I loaded up into my uncle's truck, and we left early in the dawn to do our fishing. When we made it to the lake, it was something out of a fisherman's dream. Calm and pristine, with no other soul in sight. There was a rather precarious fishing dock, one that seemed to float on the water, and had no guardrails or anything of that nature. We decided to set up shop there. Once my pole was baited and my line cast in the water, my dad and uncle went back to the truck for their chairs and the cooler, so they could have something to relax with and to enjoy whatever snacks and drinks they had brought along as well. All the fishing gear was already out on the dock, so they didn't need to worry about that. I didn't think anything about being left alone on the dock with my uncle and dad going back to the car, because all I had to do was look behind me and there they'd be. Frankly, my attention was drawn to the sky of all things. Birds of prey were always a fascination with me, and I looked above me to see if there were any in the sky. I always admired how the hawks and ospreys seemed to be expert fishermen on the many fishing excursions I've been on, while I would be lucky to even get a bite. Bald eagles had been said to be in Oregon, though they were rare, and yet places like lakes around the Oregon coast were where you would find them, and so I thought maybe I'd see one that day. So focused I was on my thoughts that what happened next for me didn't register until I was on the ground. Something had jerked me forward so hard that my wheelchair not only did a 180-degree turn, but spilled me out onto the dock as well. This wasn't just a strong or big fish, because if that were the case, I would have been pulled straight in from the front of my wheelchair into the water. Instead, it felt as if something had grabbed hold of my right wheel and wrenched so hard that instead of falling straight into the water, I instead did a 180 turn and spilled out of the wheelchair onto my stomach. This thought that flashed through my mind was further cemented when my wheelchair was pulled away from me and I heard it splash into the water. Thankfully, and I can't mean this sincerely enough, I always made it a habit to cut the seatbelts off of my wheelchairs whenever I got them. Otherwise, this encounter of mine would have probably ended up differently. Yet no sooner than when I heard my wheelchair go into the lake, I felt a pressure close around one of my legs before I was pulled backwards as I made a desperate attempt to crawl away, giving an involuntary shout as I was yanked back. There was nothing to grasp onto on the dock to anchor myself, and so in sheer panic, I rolled myself onto my back, not thinking of what I'd encounter, and that's when I finally saw it. That face. The face was the only thing I could look at. It was so human in its oval, feminine appearance with sharp, tooth-like scales running vertically down the entire area of her flesh, like some sort of natural armor that were a mottled greenish blue-gray color that matched the water. Atop her head were these gently writhing, long, fleshy strands of muscle that, to me, looked like seaweed that cascaded behind her back. There was a nose with normal nostrils like a human, but with small gill-like slits fluttering on the sides of where her nose was. Then there were those eyes, those amber golden eyes with the soft rectangular black pupil. If I were to compare them now with another animal, it would be an octopus. They were so full of rage and anger, yet also an unmistakable intelligence. Part of the way I've tried to cope with this encounter of mine is by actually trying to humanize my attacker, despite her being far from it, which is why I refer to her as I do. It seemed as soon as my eyes locked with hers, it triggered an enraged response as she leapt her body on top of mine. I couldn't guess why she didn't try and just pull me into the water to finish me off. Maybe she thought it'd be easier to kill me on land before she dragged me into the lake's depths. I remember as the being was on top of me, feeling a sharp stinging sensation envelop my back, which, although excruciatingly painful, was nothing compared to the terror that was trying to rip my face off as the creature bared its human-like teeth, despite the obvious serrations on the end of them. Instinctively, I brought my arms and hands into a defensive position before managing to get my forearm underneath the creature's throat, while my other hand pressed against her forehead, which caused her to utter a frustrated, somewhat strangled hiss. I know I was screaming frantically at the top of my lungs. I know I was crying. There was no time to think, just act in that situation, and that's what I did until my uncle came and struck the thing in the face and head with his boot. Repeatedly. Almost simultaneously, my dad struck the being in the back of the head with the fishing club, the weapon breaking on the fifth strike over her skull. It was here the being's grip loosened on me, and I was pulled away, while at the same time hearing something heavy sliding back into the water at what I assumed was the thing retreating. From there, I was carried back into my uncle's truck, with my dad and uncle barking orders at each other. I remember being sat upright in the back, because apparently I had severe lacerations all over my back, and my dad sat beside me the entire ride, as my uncle drove us to the nearest hospital, simultaneously calling an ambulance for me. The attack couldn't have lasted longer than a minute, from the time the thing grabbed my chair and tried to pull me into the lake, to my dad and uncle fighting her off. At the hospital, my uncle and father blamed the nature of my wounds on a mountain lion, which I went along with, because none of us had the energy to try to explain what we saw. There were lacerations on my arms, back, and even my leg, where that being had grabbed me. This satisfied the doctors enough with our response. Eventually, when I brought up the subject with my uncle and father, they told me the same thing, and they heard me screaming and saw a large being pressed atop me. When they rushed in, they got a very good look at it, and both of them described the same thing. It was about the size of an average man at 6 feet, and those same sharp, toothy-looking scales adorned its entire body, along with that same mottled blue-green-grayish color. Its strong arms were wrapped behind my back as it tried to take a bite out of my head. From the back of its neck to the base of its spine, there was apparently a single uniform row of sturdy, sharp-looking spines, almost like a crocodile, but more defined. They said my attacker had strong-looking legs as well, that ended in large taloned feet that were planted on either side of me as the creature tried to finish me off. Yet, the freakiest element to the creature, according to my uncle and father, was the thing's giant tail that was almost the length of her entire body, which they said looked like a stereotypical mermaid tail, except with the sharp-looking scales and single uniform rows of spines on either side and on top of the tail. Furthermore, when my dad recalled hitting the beast, he noted that no matter how hard he hit it, there was no blood or bruising, as if the animal's hide were a natural armor, which I wouldn't argue. A decade has passed since the incident, and I don't think I'm worse for wear, for I've had plenty of time to cope with what happened, mostly by researching what happened to me and trying to make sense of it. Interestingly enough, I found reports of a lake monster in Devil's Lake, but the description of said beast is that of an octopus, not a mermaid-type being. In fact, the only reference to mermaids in the Pacific Northwest that I found is an Inuit legend known as the Kalupalik, which is a dangerous sea being that resembles a woman and preys on humans. I've always tried to look at things with a scientific mind, and I've done the same thing with this creature I encountered. Perhaps she is a different branch of evolution from us humans, forced to be as brutal as the oceanic environment she lives in order to survive. That was no pastor's house. From Anonymous. When my sister and I were teenagers, we lived with our dad for a few months because my parents were divorced and mom needed a break. He may or may not have made some bad choices which led to the divorce, and also financials that still affect him. Due to this, he was coincidentally in between places to stay back then. Fortunately, there was a family that would be in Northern America for 10 days on church business. The husband was a pastor, and his wife was very active in the community. They had a boy and girl around our ages, so I said even before we met them that I have first dibs on the son's room. We met the family to give us a tour of the house about 3 days before they left. It's a U-shaped home. It was incredibly warm and homely when we met them. That was the same day my dad got the keys. But from the second day onwards, this lovely Christian home dropped quite a few degrees in temperature. I swear the reassuring yellow glow that emanated from within turned a dull light blue. We had to wear long sleeves and socks most of the time because there was no temperature control or fireplace. A few times it would feel like I was being watched while watching TV. There was one occasion where I was dozing off on the couch almost asleep. A voice in my head said to get up, but I thought it was the beginning of an afternoon dream. Then I thought the power went out because the TV suddenly died, only to feel a cold hand lightly wiping my cheek. Oh, bet your butt I was wide awake and standing up. I turned and looked and I could see the microwave clock from there, so I knew that the power was not out. The TV did not have a timer on it either, so it didn't make any sense for it to just go off like that. All the hair on my body stood on end, and I had this instinctual fear of not being wanted in the house. So I ran outside, had a smoke, and pretended nothing happened. The curtains of the darned sliding door would often move too, even when it and all the windows were closed. There was no breeze, but oh well. On some nights I heard footsteps on the roof, I initially thought someone was throwing tennis balls from the street. However, it sounded more like a heavy thing was slowly walking up there. This scared me, but then, after a while, it made me mad, and the angrier I got, the slower the walking would be, as if they were aware I was getting ticked off. After the fourth night, I just ignored it completely, because neither my sister nor my dad heard anything at all. They thought I was nuts. Something funny did happen though. It was after midnight, and once again someone was pacing all over the roof. I suddenly got a text message from my sister. She asked me to please come over and switch on her light. There was something in her room. I was a bit annoyed because I was sleep deprived, and I yelled at her to switch it on herself. She texted again that she's scared to the bone. Just please come, she said. Now I did what any older sister would do. I stormed into her room, switched on the light, and scowled at her, demanding to know what the heck was going on. She had the covers up to her nose, and she was on the verge of tears. She said that there's something running along the wall that was behind her bed. Note, the particular wall was absolutely covered with posters. My eyes narrowed. Saying nothing, I took a step forward, closed the door, and switched off the light. About 3 minutes later, I hear something scurrying like a mouse, but along the wall. Soon as the light came on, we both saw a very fat gecko dashing behind one of the posters. That was hilarious, but my sister nearly screamed at me that it wasn't funny. It's astonishing that we didn't wake our dad, as he's a relatively light sleeper. Anyway, that was the only humorous event. At times I would see movement in the corner of my vision. My sister also saw these movements. Our dad, as stoic as he was, began getting dark circles under his eyes and a change in temperament. It was subtle at first, but his views got shorter and shorter until one night we were having some redundant argument, and I ended up yelling at him that this is not the house of a pastor and his family. This house had demons, and I couldn't wait to get the heck out of there. I won't bore you with how that went, but needless to say, we weren't on speaking terms until my dad finally found another place and the owners came back. Oh, the family portrait which hung in the hallway to the bedrooms was broken while we slept. I can't remember which night this happened, but my dad blamed me for it. He also blamed me for the funny smells around the house. I can't remember what the smells were, I just recall being reminded of a very smoky barbecue next to a landfill kind of smell. So that's the time we house sat. It's something I've never done again. Everything that happened in that place hasn't happened before or since. To my knowledge, we were never given any ritual or instructions. It was just the basic, don't break anything, set the alarms, make sure the doors are locked at night kind of stuff. Maybe that family's presence kept the dark things away, or suppressed. I don't know. I just don't want to ever go back there. Holiday Binge or Encounter with the Paranormal. From Nanu Nanu. I was born and raised in Spain, but traveled a lot to the US, and I lived there at several intervals. On one of my returns to Spain from living and working in the US for a Christmas break of 2004, I concerted to meet with a few university cronies of mine for some good old catching up. Tapeo, it's like a light snacking with wine and other appetizers, and wine drinking. I hadn't seen some of them in a year or more, and it felt like our meeting was overdue. Since my mother's home was in the center of town, it's a province in northern Spain. She has since moved countries. My friends decided to meet there, and we would all walk downtown to a tapas bar we were all familiar with, and began our night out. The night was crisp and cold. There had been a light dusting of snow, nothing significant, but I bundled up well enough. Plus a nice walk would be the proper amount of exercise I needed to shake the jet lag I was feeling. Transatlantic flights always kick me in the shins, but I needed to take advantage of my time home as I was only going to be there for a week. My friends started to filter in around 11 p.m. Our nightlife starts quite late, and at midnight, after some fresh-baked pastries made by my mom, we were all walking down to the bar chatting and laughing. There were a few different groups of people also in the same festive mood as we were, walking to and from the town center. My hometown looks marvelous for the holidays, and there were a few gaiteros, or bagpipers, playing folk tunes here and there. The streets smelled of sweets, or so I thought. You could probably tell I was happy. We soon arrived at the bar, sat down, ordered tapas and wine, and started our night. It was great to see and talk to my friends. The music was lively, the food was great, and the wine was amazing. I was able to catch some escanseo, a ritual of pouring cider in a glass. The night went on, fine and fast. After talking to one of my friends about her life and about my life across the pond, choking on some jokes and growing hoarse from singing holiday songs and hooting like mad, the feeling of my head swimming brought me back to reality, and I looked at the time on my cell phone screen, realizing that it was close to 4 a.m. We were drunk, all of us, but in good spirits. More piercing laughter and joking, but it was late, and we were tired. It was time to call it a night or a day. After downing the last of our wine and cider, a few stretches, failed attempts at standing, and remaining as straight as possible after the bender we engaged on, we set out into the cold dawn light to get back to my mother's so we could all sleep before my friends were to return to their respective homes. It started flurrying again, and the chill was terrible. But I know I didn't feel it. Not immediately. I was warm from wine, cider, and good friends. My feet made a light crunch as I made it up the road, chuckling at some comments my friends made. I felt like we were the only people outside at that hour, and by the empty look of the street we were on, I believed it. Everything was quiet, muffled, like it was wrapped in cotton or something else noise isolating. As I kept on trekking, looking up at the sky, flurries that looked like sugar drifted down. My head swam more as we passed by the town's cathedral. But the swimming wasn't pleasant. It wasn't that good feeling you get from being drunk. No, this felt disorienting. I started to drag behind my friends. I began to slow down imperceptibly to my cronies, trying to clear my head, find my balance. The swimming intensified. And then I felt as if I'd been hit. My eyes rolled up, focusing on the rooftops of the old cathedral, as if they were forcefully directed to focus there, to bear witness almost. I don't know how to put it. I heard a screeching noise. This screech ringed out. My eyes lingered on the rooftops, widening. A cloaked figure appeared up there, black as midnight, blacker than the sky. It seemingly materialized. I mean, in a second, it was just there. It didn't have a face, no identifiable features, just a cloak, and at its center, there was something that looked like an orb, slightly lighter than the blackness of the figure. I gasped, or I think I gasped. Then I heard a ripping noise, and I felt a ripping feeling, a tremble, right at the very center of my being. Time seemed to stop, at least to me it did. I could only stare at this figure. I couldn't look away from it, and I couldn't move. Then I could see details, like the gentle sway of the fabric, and how the snow seemed to avoid touching the thing's cloak. Was it porous? Old? Covered in dust? It was like the figure was part, but also not part, of the surroundings. I mean, it occupied the space, it was distinct, but nothing in the environment around it wanted to come into contact with it. It was as if nature itself rejected whatever it was. The figure didn't move either, but just as it appeared in my vision, it vanished. The swimming in my head slowly subsided, and the screeching noise I thought I heard was nothing more than the voice of one of my friends, calling my name gently. He was asking if I was okay. I was staring at the ground, flurries collecting on my shoulders. Steadily, I looked up, and just as slowly I began to breathe, the air fogging around me, giving me life almost. I was holding my breath, and I hadn't even realized it until my friend had called me. I shook all over and nodded to him that I was fine. I moved and I caught up with my friends. We resumed our walk, and I just shook my head. Looking back at the cathedral, I sighed. I was drunk, I reminded myself, but still. We arrived at my mom's and we got to bed. I felt strange. What had happened? Had I imagined that? Or was it the booze? It all felt real. I soon fell asleep. I try not to think about this often. I went back to my life, enjoyed the holidays, flew back to the US, went back to work. Time passed. Eventually, I left the US and went back to Spain. I worked some more and met my now husband and moved back to the US, which is where I currently reside. I don't know if what I saw was real, or just the product of my brain swimming in booze. There aren't any stories or legends I can think of that could produce a paranormal experience in that area. Perhaps it was just me being drunk. I hope that's what it was, but, well, sometimes I feel even now close to that sensation of swimming, and I can almost hear the screeching before I, with sheer willpower, crawl out of it. So I ask, did I imagine it all due to being smashed, or did something paranormal truly happen? I don't know, and honestly, I don't think I want to know.